Let us begin with AngularJS today. So this is the outline of the topics that we need to cover for AngularJS. So let us start with a small briefing on AngularJS and try to understand. So firstly, let us understand why we are using AngularJS. So as you can see, it is just yet another framework which is built upon JavaScript. So naturally, it will be used on the client end predominantly, and we need to process the data, whichever data is going to be accepted from the user. If we want to process that data, so for that reason, we are going to use the AngularJS framework. Okay. Now, being a JavaScript, broadly speaking, we need to embed all the AngularJS code inside the script tag. Okay, in HTML page, we will use the script tag, and whatever AngularJS code we have, we can add to the script tag. But before we use, we will have to either link to that framework, or we'll have to download it and then link it locally. So that linking is also performed using the script tag. Okay, here below in the syntax you can see we are using the script tag, and for the source we are using the Google APIs, the AngularJS framework provided by Google APIs, and we are then accessing the appropriate version depending upon what is supported by your browser. Okay, so this is how we are going to use AngularJS. We're going to link to the AngularJS. Fine. But what exactly additional we are doing except the conventional HTML code? How we are going to use AngularJS with HTML? So we are having some additional attributes to the HTML tags. When we are using AngularJS with the conventional attributes that we have already seen for several HTML tags, we are having some additional attributes, and those additional attributes in AngularJS are called as directives. Okay, we'll see about the directives. And when we are trying to use the data of maybe of HTML form, right? So we need to bind that data with the AngularJS application, right? We need to convert that form data into AngularJS application data, right? And then we need to compute something, or we need to display something, whatever operations we have to perform with that data. So that can be done with the help of the mechanism called as expressions. Okay, so directives and expressions, two main important things when we are using AngularJS. Fine. Okay, moving ahead. So as I told, is AngularJS application is nothing but an extension to the HTML, and that extension comes in the form of the directives. Okay, ng directives. Any attribute which is having a prefix of ng is called as a AngularJS directive. Now, first, we need to understand how we will be able to create a AngularJS application, or how we need to define the AngularJS application. Right? So for defining, or when we are talking about already created AngularJS applications, at that time we'll talk about linking those already created AngularJS applications, right? So either we have to define or we have to link any of the AngularJS applications. For that purpose, we will use the ng app directive. Okay, for defining and linking AngularJS application to the current HTML document. Understood? So these three are the main AngularJS directives. So that is why we are discussing, or we will be using these three more frequently. That is why we are discussing in detail. Okay. So first directive, as I told, will be used to define your AngularJS application and then link it to the current HTML document. Fine. Second is called as the ng model. Now, what it does is it will bind whatever controls you have taken in the form, HTML input controls. So whatever data is currently lying in those controls, it will bind that all those data values with the AngularJS application data. So you can think that we are, from those values, whatever are lying in each of the input controls, we are creating application data from those values. In short, we are creating AngularJS variables. You can imagine in that way. Okay. And values for those variables will be taken from the respective input controls. Okay. Now, once that is done, we can perform any operations by using that data, either through the use of expression, or we can simply display those values, okay, wherever it is required. So for displaying those values, again, that Angular JS application data needs to be bound with the HTML tags, isn't it? Because displaying is the authority of HTML tags. So whatever uh, values we have grabbed in those application variables, we need to display those values, and for that we need to bind those data values with the HTML tag. Now, how do we bind those values? By using the ng bind directive. Understood? So as simple as, we'll see an example and things will be more clear. Okay, fine. Yeah, prior to that, a small briefing about MVC architecture. We know it very well, that model view controller is the popular software design pattern, and it works on the principle of model, view, and control. Now, what we are doing in the model part, we are simply managing or maintaining the data, right? In the view part, we are uh, we are going to take care about displaying or representation of the data to the user, and in the controller part, we are going to take care about the interactions between the model and the view. So if we talk analogously, so we are going to compare the three-tier architecture with MVC, right? So at the front, we have some HTML documents which are responsible for displaying the data to the user. Then at the extreme end, we have the database tier, which is going to perform maintenance of the data or management of the data. And in between, we have the server side programs, right, which perform the task of controlling, or which are the intermediate for the interaction between your HTML documents or the data which is displayed and the data being stored. Understood? So your servlet or any server side program, you can imagine to be a controller. Understood? So that is the MVC architecture. So the AngularJS framework is also based on this MVC framework, MVC model, I mean. Okay. Okay, so let us see the steps how to create any small AngularJS application. So firstly, as I told, we need to load the framework. So we can either do it locally, or we can give the URL for the angular.min.js file, like we have done over here in step 1 using the script tag. Right. Secondly, observe here, we need to define the AngularJS application. And for doing so, we know we need to use the ng app directive, right? So we are doing here the same. Now, understand one thing, your HTML document will have many tags, and your AngularJS application may be created or maybe uh, it may be related to either of the tags, maybe to a particular division, may be related to the entire body of the HTML document, may be related to a particular paragraph, right? So an HTML document can have more than one AngularJS modules working together, right? So for example, we are creating the AngularJS application for a particular division. So for that division tag, we will define the ng app attribute. Okay. And if it is required, we can put some name in double quotes for that particular AngularJS application module. Now, when do we give a name for this application module? When we have to define a controller for it, or when we are going to use this module as a part of some another module. At that time, this name is used. Okay, for now, let us keep it blank. It is allowed. Okay, and in between that, we will define all our AngularJS application program, whatever it is, and then finally we will close that division. Okay. Now, in between these opening and closing of division tag, we need to define model name. That means, in short, we need to create some input controls, and we need to attach or we need to define some application data variables in those input controls, right, using the ng model directive. So what we are doing here, we have just created a input text type of control, and as I said, like if you remember, we used to give a name attribute, right? So instead of that name attribute, now we will have ng model attribute, and whatever name you want to give, you can provide the name in double quotes, right? Now what it does is it will create a variable with this particular name, whatever you have provided in double quotes. Okay, for AngularJS application, it will create a variable with this particular name, and value for that variable will be taken from the user. Whatever I type in the input field, that will be the value for this name variable. Understood? So that is the case. Now, once the value is taken from the user, as I told, we need to display that. And for doing that, we will use the ngbind directive. Okay, so I can use any HTML tag, maybe a paragraph tag also. And for that tag, I will have a ngbind attribute. Okay, and if I specify the name of that application data variable over here, so it will be displaying the value for that variable straight away. Understood over here? So we'll see this example. We'll execute it. So here also we are doing the same, no different, but instead of using the span tag, we have directly defined the ngbind attribute for the p tag. Okay, and whatever value is there for this name variable, that will be displayed as a part of that paragraph. Okay, so copy this code and we'll see what it results. Okay, so when we run this, you can see we have an input field over here. Now whatever I will type in that input field, the application data variable will be having that value. That means the name variable will have that value, and the same value will be displayed as a part of paragraph. Suppose if I type my name, just think. did not define the div app. Okay, anyways, this is the same example here. Yeah, so instead of h1 we are going to use so here whatever I am typing, the same thing is being displayed as a part of your h1 tag, since I have defined the ngBind attribute for my h1 tag, and I'm using the variable name over here, which is name. So whatever value is there, that will be that whatever value I have typed in the text field, that will be displayed as a part of the inner HTML property for my h1 tag. Okay, so small example of AngularJS. Okay, any doubt by far, anyone? Okay, fine. Moving ahead. So here's a brief explanation about what example we saw. So whenever we load the web page, at that time the AngularJS will start automatically, and the ng app attribute or directive that we have used, it will tell AngularJS that div is the element which will be the owner for our AngularJS application. Okay, because we have created the ng app directive for the div tag. Okay, next, ng model directive will bind the value of the input field to the application variable, which is called as name. This ng bind directive will bind the inner HTML property of the p tag to the variable with the name name. Okay, so ultimately what we'll be able to see is, we have seen whenever user will input something in the input field, it will be displayed as the inner HTML property for p tag. And finally we'll end the application by closing the division tag. That's all. Okay. Yeah, another thing, uh, if you want to directly use the value, like here what we did is directly use the value of the variable name. So at that time, we can define the ngBind directive and provide the application data variable name, right? But if you want to compute something with that variable's value, then we have to define an expression. Okay, how do we do that? Simply, whatever variable we have, we will enclose that variable in double bracket, double curly braces, right? And it will display the value as it is. Uh, but this sort of representation is called as expression. Okay, and whatever you perform, if the variables are numeric in nature, then you can define a mathematical expression over here, and whatever is the result of that expression, that will be displayed to the user. Understood? So that is another variant. Okay, fine. Okay, let us go to the next section, which is related to directives, expressions, and controllers. Okay, three of which we have all directives. We have seen the main three directives: ng app, ng model, and ng bind. But there are many more. We'll see whatever is required over here. Right. So ng app used to start the AngularJS application, and with which we are loading any AngularJS module. So we know about it. Init is another one. So init we are using to initialize the application data. Okay, so whenever suppose we have a, like we had the name field in the last example that we saw, but we didn't have any default value, right? Any default value for the name field, right? So in order to define that default value, we can use the init attribute. So for any AngularJS application, whenever we are defining that application using any tag, for example div, there itself another attribute of init is defined, and what we have to place as a value for init attribute, all the uh, application data variables we can initialize over here in this fashion. Understood? So name of the application data variable and the value. Okay, that is the use of init. Model we already know. Fourth one is repeat. Okay, so what we are doing here is, if we want any set of HTML elements or any set of HTML tags to be repeated, then we will use this repeat directive. Okay, and how many times it will repeat? So definitely it has to repeat for a certain amount of times. So that number of iterations depends upon the size of any collection, maybe an array, maybe a object, whatever it is. So here you can see uh, generally we use repeat whenever we have to create tables in AngularJS, or we have to create list in AngularJS, right? So here we are creating a ordered list, and definitely we will have to use a li tag, and to define the inner HTML property of that li tag, we are using ngRepeat. Okay, now how many times this will repeat? Whenever suppose we are having an array called as countries, which we have defined in the using init, and we will access one value of that array, one element of that array at a time. That value will be placed in this variable before in whatever you define it, and then you can display it using the expressions mechanism, right? So that value will be displayed as a list element straight away. Okay, yeah. So uh, whenever we, as I told, whenever we have to bind the application data to the HTML, we have two choices. One, we will go for the ngBind attribute, and other way is to use the expressions, right? So both behave in the same way, and whatever output data we have to display, so AngularJS will display that output exactly whatever is written in the expression. It will compute if it is required. So if we are using numbers, for example, cost and quantity are two values, uh, having numeric values, I mean, so it will display the result of this expression as a part of the p tag. Okay, similarly, if we are using two strings in the expression, like here f1 a space and then f name and space and l name, then it will display the string values. And if we want to access objects in the expression, then we need to mention the object dot the the attribute of that object. Maybe student is the object and roll number is the attribute. So this is how the expression will be evaluated. If we are using arrays, simply we will mention the array name and the index value as a part of the expression. Likewise. Okay. This was all about the directives provided by AngularJS. There are many more. As and when we are required, it is required, we will be discussing about the additional directives. Then coming to the controller. Okay, so whenever we have a AngularJS application, we will have a controller. In most of the cases, we will have a controller for each of the application module, and which will control the data flow for that particular application. Okay, now if we have to define a controller for any application, we will use the ng controller directive. Okay, and for every controller, whenever we'll define that controller, we'll see an example. So whenever we will define the controller, we will have to define a function. Okay, and for that function, the default parameter, or the only parameter I should say, will be $scope. Okay, so it refers to the scope of that particular AngularJS application module for which the controller is being created. Okay, so as you can see, it will refer to the application or to the module for which the controller is created, or for which the controller has to control the data flow. Okay, firstly, since ng controller is also a directive and a controller is assigned to a particular application module, so whenever we will define the AngularJS application module, like we did in the div tag, at the same time we have to define the controller also for the same module. So I have a AngularJS application with the name my app, and the controller for this particular application module is my control, for example. Understood? Now let us go ahead and see the exact working of this particular directive. Okay, you can see an example over here in which we have defined a Angular module, my app, and a controller for it. Okay, we have two input fields, both of text type, and we have defined the ng model directive, and we have created two application data variables, first name and last name. Okay, and then finally using the expression mechanism, we are displaying it in a particular manner. Okay. Okay, now in the script tag, you can see we are defining the controller. Okay, so how do I take how do I refer to a particular AngularJS module? So I'll have to use a variable, and by using the angular.module function, I will provide the name of my AngularJS module. Okay, name of the module in this case is my app. Okay, now I will get the reference to that particular module in this variable app variable. Understood? What is the second argument to this function, angular.module function? It is nothing but a array of dependent modules. So if there are any other dependent modules which are dependent on my app, so I will have to define those name of those modules in this array. For now it is empty. Okay, there is no dependent module. Okay, now once I have got reference to the application module, now I will have to define a controller for that module. So how do I do that? Variable name, whatever variable name I took for reference, that dot controller function, and I will mention the name of the controller. Okay, now what a controller does, it tries to define a function over here, as I told. Okay, and that function will interact, or it will try to access and modify the variable names, the application variable names that we have created over here. Okay, so as I told, the one and only parameter for this function is the scope parameter, $scope. Okay, now what this scope means, we are accessing the data variables from this my app application module. Okay, that is the scope. Understood? So $scope dot first name means first name for which application? This my app application. Understood? For that, I'm assigning some value as John, and the last name I'm assigning some value Doe. Okay, and then I'm closing that function. Once I close that function, I will also close the uh, controller function and put a semicolon. Okay, now let us try to see what exactly we get as output for this particular piece of code. Let us firstly see the output. So as you can see, we have nothing over here. So default, whatever we type, nothing will appear. But now if we include another script, HTML we have the body. Yeah, if I define some script, you can see these, as I run the script, you can see some value is also inserted in the respective text fields. Why this is happening? Because these, let me adjust it once. Yeah. We are getting hold of these variables, these AngularJS application variables, through the controller, and then we are assigning value to those variables. Now naturally, whatever value we assign, that is displayed in the respective text field also. And then since we are accessing it and putting it in the expression, you can see this output. Okay, any doubt by far? Anyone understood how to use the controller or any AngularJS application? Any doubt? Fine. Moving ahead. Yeah, the same explanation is given over here, nothing else. Let's move to the filters that we have in AngularJS. Okay. Now, what do we mean by filters? Generally, these filters are nothing but some extension to any directive. Okay. Now, what we are using them for? Either we are using them for modification of the data, either we are using them for arranging the data, or we are using them for refinement of the data. Okay, that means filtering the data in the literal sense. Okay, so whatever filter type we are using, that filter will be used or will be clubbed with either an expression or a directive using the pipe character. Okay, that is a vertical symbol, vertical line. Okay, now what all filters do we have? We have the uppercase filter. So if we use this uppercase filter, it will convert the text into upper cases. Similarly, lowercase is another filter. Currency is another filter. Whatever value we have, if we provide the currency filter, it will format that text value in any currency format. Then we have a filter type of filter. It's literally, we are going to filter out some subset from a given array. depending upon whatever criteria is provided. Okay, and then we have order by filter, which is going to arrange any array based upon the provided criteria. Okay, so here's an example. You can see if we are using the uppercase filter, following will be the way we have defined a input field of text type, and we have used the ng model for defining a variable first name. Okay, now whenever a name will be typed, that in the text field, it will be in small cases also, so it is going to convert that into upper cases and then it will display. Since we have created an expression of that, it will display in upper cases. Understood? So likewise, after the pipe symbol, we can use any of the other filters. Maybe a criteria is required, that criteria will be defined in brackets. Then moving ahead, how to create tables in AngularJS. So simply we know for doing that we will require the ng repeat directive. So in order to do that, whatever tags we use for table creation, all those tags will be included in the ng repeat directive. Okay, for example, uh, we are creating a table having two columns, name and city, and we need to create rows to have rows in that table, right? So for the tr tag that we use for creating rows, we will define the ng repeat attribute, right? And as I told, what will be the value? It will access row values either from an array or a collection or an object, and then it will display, it will one at a time, the element will be stored in this variable, maybe called as entry, and then we are accessing. Here we can consider collection is an array of objects, and we are picking one array from this collection in entry, providing a reference to that in entry, and then we are accessing the data members of that object, entry.name, entry.city, likewise. And where we are putting that, we are putting those name and cities as a part of expression, which will be kept for the td tag. Okay, so naturally data will be put in that particular row, and this will keep on repeating for all the objects present in the this collection. Understood? So for creating tables, this is a significant directive, ng repeat. Okay. Okay, let us come to modules. What is meant by AngularJS modules? Now, we know naturally whenever we talk about modules, so we are creating modules because it will reduce our efforts of maintenance, right? So if there is a separate business logic, so we'll create a separate module for that, as simple as that. Okay, so that we'll be able to debug it, we'll be able to maintain it, and we'll be able to handle errors easily. That is the simple reason for creating modules, right? So modules in AngularJS can be created in two ways. Either that module will be a controller module, like we saw how the controller module was created, right? Otherwise, it will be a application module, okay, which we create using the ng app directive. Okay, so example for both. Firstly, any application module, if we want to create, so we will have to declare that application module by using the function angular.module. We have seen this, right? When we created the controller, at that time, firstly we had to create the application module. So by using the angular.module function, we'll specify the module name, and then we'll specify the array of dependent modules. Okay, fine. Next, in order to create the controller module, we saw whatever reference we got for the application module in this variable, that for that reference we will define the controller using the controller function. Okay, and we'll name that controller, and we'll define a function for that controller to perform. Okay, so two types of modules. Now whenever this is the way we'll define the two types of modules, and when it comes to using those two modules, we know we will specify uh, any tag wherever the AngularJS application is to be defined, and then for the ng app attribute we'll specify the application module name, and for the ng controller directive we'll specify the controller name, whatever we created over here. Okay. Forms. Now talking about forms, we will there is a set of uh, events that we need to handle, and for each of the events we have a separate directive. The most common event that we use is onClick, right? We define the onClick attribute, right? For that, we will use the ngClick directive to handle any button clicks in AngularJS application. Okay, and we will use some values like $dirty or $invalid flag. Whenever we will have to perform validation, we will use these flags. Okay, so we'll see them in detail. Okay, what all directives we have to handle the events? So you know, ng click, ng double click, mouse down, mouse up, mouse over. If we move the mouse over a particular image, over a particular division, over a particular control, in that case mouse over event will get triggered. Key down, key up, and key press naturally related to the key press. So key press deals with alphanumeric values. Key down and key up relates to the arrow keys. Okay. Now the input controls, and we know we can use the input tag with its different variants, with its type attribute. We can have different variants of input field. Similarly, we can use the button tag also, we can use the select tag also to define menus, and then we can use text area tag. Okay, to validate all these the data coming from all these input controls, as I told, we have three values. Okay, $dirty, $invalid, and $error. Okay, now what this $dirty says, it shows that since these are boolean flag values, whenever there is a change made, it will be turned to 1. Okay, and if whatever value we have entered in these input controls, if it is invalid according to certain rule, then this flag will be turned to 1, invalid flag. Okay, and if we want to state an error, we will see that this error flag is turned to 1. Okay, let's see the example. Okay, so what we are doing here, we are defining a form with the text box. Okay, so that means simply we are using an input tag with text type, and we are defining that input field for a form. So you can see that the input field is enclosed by a form tag. So whatever we enter, we can see over here in the expression, it will be displayed. Okay. If we take a checkbox in the form, you will see, so I mean this particular AngularJS is designed that uh, whatever attribute we select, if it is made true, then it will be displayed over here. My header will be displayed over here. Okay, so that is the use of a checkbox in this particular application. So what we are doing exactly here, we are defining a variable myWhere for a checkbox type of input field, right? Over here you can see, and naturally its value will be either true or false. Okay, so if ng-show is equal to 0, then this header will not be shown, and if ng-show is another boolean type of directive. Okay, its value can be 1 or 0. So if this checkbox is checked, then this myWhere will carry a value 1. In this case, this header will be displayed. Otherwise, that header won't be displayed. Okay, that is the checkbox over here. Right. Many other examples we can see for the other type of input controls also, like select, button, whatever. Whenever it is required, you can use them. Okay. Next is includes. So whenever we need to refer to any external file, may it be a HTML file, maybe a HTML file, anything. So in that case, we will have to use the ng include directive. Okay. So for example, uh, we are defining a AngularJS application for the entire body of the HTML page. As you can see, we have put the ng-app directive attribute for the body tag. In that, if we want to include any external file, so we will have to use the ng include directive for the for a particular section we want to include that file, so we will use the div tag. Otherwise, if we want to include that file for the entire body of the HTML page, we will put the ng include attribute for the body tag only. Okay, very obvious. Okay, so here we are, you can see we are referring to external .html file, myfile.html. Okay. Okay, so this is an example of includes directive where we are having a form, basically an input field, and we are referring to the HTML documents data from this particular form. Okay, so here you can see on the right hand side there is a HTML document AngularJS.html, right, in which we have Angular application module called as main app, and we have a controller for that. Okay, so what this controller is going to do, it is going to access sorry, it is going to access the data fields of HTML.html main.html file, and is going to initialize those input fields from this uh, controller part, as you can see. So first name will be initialized from the scope function. From the function, we are accessing the scope, and then we are initializing the student object. So in the scope of main app, we are using a student object, and the first name attribute of this student object is initialized with a value called as Mahesh, and last name is Prashant, right? So that is how it goes. Simple use of include directive. Fine. So as you can see, the output will be firstly whatever the value was. Next, whatever, if we insert some another value, it will show corresponding result over here. Fine. Views we will continue in our next session.